Missouri lawmakers are discussing policies targeting undocumented immigrants in the state. A pair of proposed bills would impose criminal penalties on someone who enters the state without proper documentation. Capitol Bureau Chief Joe McLean is in Jefferson City with both sides.
Two bills debated Monday would target undocumented immigrants in Missouri, with sponsors saying the policies are meant to prevent the possible future harm migrants may cause.
This is preemptive legislation to let illegal immigrants know that Missouri is not the state to come to. In Missouri, we need to stop the problem before it starts.
This bill would require all employers with more than 50 employees to enroll in a federal work authorization system. It would also create a new crime: trespass by an illegal alien, a felony count which would be automatically tacked on to even the smallest misdemeanor offense by an undocumented person. The Missouri Chamber of Commerce opposes the bill because it would impose new government regulations on businesses, regulations which are already established law.
Right now, if you hire an unauthorized individual in Missouri, you can lose your license, both temporarily or permanently, under multiple infractions. If with federal government laws, you get fined up to $3,000 per unauthorized hire.
And Gabrielle Eisner with the Interfaith Committee on Latin America spoke out against the bill as well, calling it needlessly cruel.
You're creating this disproportionate punishment for a very minor offense, which for someone who is undocumented can lead to detention and deportation and ultimately family separation.
Another bill, sponsored by State Senator Bill Eigel, would bar undocumented people from enrolling in colleges. It would also create a criminal offense for entering the state without documentation.
Senate Bill 1372 attempts to be proactive in how we deal with illegal immigration in the state of Missouri.
Eisner said she believes these policies are only meant to generate attention at the expense of human dignity.
These bills aren't created for Missourians. Missouri does not have a problem with immigration. Missouri is not a border state. They're a political act that, in an election year to get a soundbite.
The bill is likely to be heard again in the Homeland Security Committee before it gets a vote. In Jefferson City, Joe McLean, WGEM News.